With all eyes on Juan Soto and free agency, there has not been much speculation about Pete Alonso. Where will he sign? How does Soto's decision impact what happens with Pete? We're going to talk about it all on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Lately, when it comes to free agency, there's been one name that has been talked about a ton, and that's Juan Soto. But Pete Alonso is a free agent right now as well. Any team could give Pete Alonso a $200+ million contract offer and sign him tomorrow. Yet, we have not heard a single thing about his free agency. Alex Bregman, there's been some reports that the Astros are trying to bring him back. Willy Adames has had a ton of teams showing interest. We haven't even been getting the X team shows interest in Pete Alonso reports out there. It's just been quiet. The most relevant story about Pete Alonso's free agency right now, if you Google his name, it's the fact that there was a caller on WFAN that said he ran into Pete Alonso in a pub in Ireland. Now, I listened to the little clip from, I think it was Evan and Tiki, and I mean, it sounded real. It sounded plausible. The guy did not seem like he was lying, but I mean, come on. It's a WFAN caller. Is he really being truthful about running into Pete Alonso in some pub? I don't know. He had a lot of information, a lot of details, I should say, about his story that made it almost seem like it was real. And the big line that was the takeaway from the whole thing is he said he implored Pete to, make sure that Boris was fair in the negotiations and to get Cohen to sign him or whatever it was. And Pete Alonso told him, I want to be there, so it's up to Boris and Mr. Cohen. Now, again, I don't know how much to read into this story. It does sound like something Pete Alonso would say, but that's also why it could have been made up. The idea that it comes down to other parties for Pete Alonso's free agent decision and he doesn't have a say in it, that's a little ridiculous. And it could be partly true. Like the way Scott Boras manages his clients, he certainly seems to sort of nudge them in a particular direction, although ultimately the decisions should still be theirs. If Pete Alonso is going into the market and his sole goal is to come back to the Mets, but to be paid, commensurate to his value, it really is up to Cohen and David Stearns more than anything, more than even Scott Boras. It's a matter of if they want him back. And we don't know that. We really don't. Juan Soto is all we know about. The Mets are all in there. So that's what we're all waiting on. And we did get a little bit of actual credible information today from Jeff Passan. He's the gold standard when it comes to MLB reporters. When he says something, you can take it to the bank. So here's what Jeff Passan said about Juan Soto. First of all, he said he might get more than $700 million. He said he's going to get at least $600 million, might get more than $700 million in present day value. So we're not talking about deferrals like Shohei Ohtani. We're talking about $700 million. Now, which teams are still in it? He says the Mets, the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Blue Jays, and the Dodgers. He said the expectation is there will be meetings over the weekend, and that's when a decision will be made, and we will know at the latest by the time the winter meetings start in Dallas. Now, those meetings begin on Sundays, technically when everyone shows up, but Monday is when things really get going. So let's just say there's a passing bomb on Saturday night. New York Mets sign Juan Soto, 15-year, $705 million deal. If it exceeds $700 million, 705, 15 years, that would break out to $47 million per season for Juan Soto. What would happen next? The Red Sox, Yankees, Blue Jays, Dodgers, they all got a lot of money to spend. And all eyes turn to Corbin Burns, Pete Alonso, Alex Bregman, and Willy Adames, as well as Max Fried. Those are the top free agents that are going to be the talking points of the winter meetings. And at the winter meetings, a lot can happen. Pete Alonso could have meetings in person with 10 teams. This is where stuff can get wild. And there's been some reporters that are predicting that everything is going to go haywire once Soto signs. And it is the perfect lead-in to the winter meetings. But how do the Mets respond to all of this? What happens if they don't sign Juan Soto? Is Pete Alonso the top priority all of a sudden? Or do they go back on what some have reported? Because, Joel Sherman said the Mets aren't in the market for the top starting pitchers, that he's hearing that they're not in on Corbin Burnes and Max Fried. But maybe that's because they really fully believe that they're going to put the top offer on Soto. And by doing so, they're going to land him if he has that motivation to return to the Yankees or to play for what could be his childhood team in the Boston Red Sox. And the Mets strike out, and now they have all this money to spend. Are they pivoting? Is it Corbin Burnes now that becomes the top priority? They decide, you know what, we can't get the best hitter on the board. Let's get the best pitcher. Is that how the focus is shifted? And if it is, how does Pete Alonso respond to that when Scott Boras represents Corbin Burnes and obviously represents Juan Soto? If Juan Soto decides to sign with the Mets, are they in the market to bring back Pete as well? John Heyman said that, Pete Alonso could be, an attractive incentive for Juan Soto. If they re-sign Pete, that could make Juan Soto more inclined to come aboard. Maybe those discussions have been had with Juan Soto. I'm sure it's been talked about at some capacity. If Juan Soto in these meetings is asking about the farm system, do you think he might ask about a guy who's hit more home runs than anybody? Or is it anybody but Aaron Judge now? Aaron Judge might have passed him up on that, but I think he's driven in more runs than anybody since 2019 when he debuted, and he's second to Aaron Judge in homers. I think Juan Soto wouldn't have just at least been curious? If I sign, what happens to Pete? So does that make it more likely that Pete Alonso comes back if they sign Juan Soto? We're going to talk about all those different implications in the next segment. Is Pete the top priority if Soto doesn't sign? If he does, do they have room for both of them? We'll go through it. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers can bet $5. You're going to get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL and all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, you live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You're going to get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Stay up to date on all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 12,000 subscribers. I appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. All right, so let's first talk about if the Mets don't sign Juan Soto. Is there a world where the Mets don't sign Juan Soto and also don't re-sign Pete Alonso? Only way I can see it is if they pivot and they look at third base and all of a sudden Alex Bregman or Willie Adames becomes their top priority. They sign one of those guys and they are committed to moving Mark Vientos to first. Here's the thing. If you do that, for one, your offense is going to take a hit because both of those guys, Adames and Bregman, are not the offensive force. They aren't the run producer that Pete Alonso is. Now, your defense gets better with both of them, particularly Willie Adames. And it does feel like a David Stearns move to target an Adames free agent over an Alonso-type free agent. But I also don't think that David Stearns is tone deaf to the fan base. And I certainly don't think Steve Cohen is tone deaf to the fan base. Public perception. I don't know if you can really go through missing out on Juan Soto after now it's being hyped as the Mets are the favorites. So there will be a letdown with the fan base if they don't land Soto. It's pretty much out of their control. They can put the best contract offer in front of them, but it's ultimately going to come down to Soto's decision. You can't fault them the same way you can't fault them for last year when they didn't land Yoshinobu Yamamoto. They tried the best they could. But you have to have a plan B. And to me, the letdown of not signing Soto, how can Alonso not be your plan B? Because if you re-sign Pete, at least you make the fan base happy. And I know there's some that don't want Pete back, and I think that's a loud minority more than it's what the whole fan base feels. And one of the reasons why I'm emboldened on that is because I polled the audience. I talked about William Adames about a month ago. And after that show, or that same day, I published a poll. If the Mets can only sign one, who should it be? Pete Alonso or William Adames? 85% of the vote came back on Pete. To me, if you don't sign Juan Soto, you re-sign Pete Alonso and you focus everything on building out the best possible pitching staff that you can, and you roll. And you bring back a lot of the components of the team last year. Maybe you are bringing back Jose Iglesias. Maybe you are bringing back Jesse Winker. Maybe you are running it back in a lot of ways with maybe some different arms in that rotation and the bullpen. And you're hoping for some progression from some of your young players, like Mark Vientos continuing what he did this past year, like Francisco Alvarez having a further breakout, particularly on the offensive side of things, like Luis Angel Acuna, who we talked about in yesterday's show, maybe carving out an everyday role or at least a very prominent role on the big league club. I think that is plan B, or at least it should be. But if you sign Juan Soto, re-signing Pete Alonso is complicated because you have to think about it more long-term. And in the short term, sure, you put Pete back at first base, you keep Vientos at third, you got Juan Soto in the outfield. It's a loaded lineup. Defense going to be a little bit shaky, particularly in the corners with Vientos, Alonso, and Soto, whatever corner they play him in. But short term, that's the best possible lineup. Long term, though, what's Juan Soto's position? Is he going to be in the corner outfield for 5 more years? Is he going to move over to first base like Bryce Harper did? Is he going to be a DH on a $700 million contract? That's where it gets complicated. That's where you have a tough decision to make. If the Mets sign Soto, and let's say it does come in at $47 million per, your core is Francisco Lindor. His luxury tax number is $33.8 million. Brandon Nimmo's luxury tax number is $22.25 million. Again, Soto, we're saying 47. You put it all together, it's about $113 million. You look at their rotation right now, Frankie Montas is costing $17 million. Kodai Senga costs $15 million. Let's just say that the Montas money, that's what an average starter is going to cost over the next 5-6 years, at least $17 million. And you need 4 of those guys because you might have one homegrown pitcher in your rotation. Ideally, you have more, but let's just talk about a realistic payroll. $17 million times 4 is 68. You put that together to 113. Let's just make it a nice round number. $180 million to have Francisco Lindor, Brandon Nimmo, Juan Soto, and a good starting rotation on the roster. And that's not counting Edwin Diaz, who still has 3 years and a club option. It's not counting Jeff McNeil's got 2 years. It's not counting Marte for this year. It's still keeping some guys out of the mix. But you're just, again, if you're focused primarily on rotation and your 3 main players, $180 million. Can you commit $25 million a year to Pete Alonso? Here's what I think is holding Pete Alonso's free agency up more than anything else. I think Pete wants to be a Met. The Mets know that. And I think they are motivated to bring him back. That's what I believe. But you can't sign Pete Alonso right now until you know what that number is on Juan Soto because you got to make the math work. And if Soto's locked in at $45 million plus per year, every single dollar you can save on the luxury tax becomes valuable. Now, I've talked about this Pete Alonso contract multiple times on this show. I've talked about how much Pete Alonso will make in free agency, how he could come back to the Mets, what that could look like. And I still have the graphic loaded in here that we can explore. If you look at this contract for Pete Alonso that we have talked about on this show, and Again, I always have to credit Christopher Soto for coming up with this. You can find him on Twitter at, I think it's Soto C803. But if you just look up Christopher Soto, Mets, you should be able to find him. Regardless, he's an accountant, and I asked him to come up with a contract for me that would get Pete Alonso over $200 million, but get the present-day value of the contract down to what the Mets offered him reportedly on an extension a couple years ago, which was $158 million. How you get there? You pay Pete Alonso a little over $16 million per season with $12 million deferred. So the average annual value on a $200 million contract over 7 years on present day value with no deferrals would be $28.5 million. But he's not going to get that. This is a contract that is more team friendly, where you have deferred money, $84 million of it, that would allow you to bring that average annual value down to $22.6 million. And I can see it being even more aggressive on either the deferrals, potentially a big signing bonus with a lot of deferrals like the contract Blake Snell just got, so that you can keep Pete Alonso, but you get his number closer and closer to $20 million instead of $25 million or more per year. And you still can give him a big number that will, kind of massage his ego and Scott Boris's ego that he got the big free agent contract still. I think this is a good framework for a deal. We've been talking about this particular contract on this show for a while now. I still like it. I did talk about it potentially being a 6-year deal instead of a 7-year deal. It just depends on his market. And in which case, that would bring obviously the totals down when it comes to total guaranteed and what he's looking at when the amount of deferred money. But to me, it makes sense to bring Pete Alonso back on a heavily deferred contract if you sign Juan Soto. If you don't sign Juan Soto, maybe the deferrals don't kick in as much because now maybe there's more pressure to sign Pete. So you don't have to be as creative with the structure. But I think if Pete Alonso really wants to be a New York Met and they've signed Juan Soto, I think a deal gets done, but it's one that is team friendly when it comes to the structure so that you can really build around a core of Lindor, Nimmo, Alonso, and Soto. But we'll see. There is every chance that the Mets sign Juan Soto and they say, all right, we're done when it comes to big spending on our starting lineup. And then Pete Alonso goes elsewhere. What other teams will be in on Pete Alonso? We still don't know. I'm going to give you my best guess in the final segment. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. If you're an everyday listener of the show, make sure to become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks. So the Mets, you can ask me questions anytime. You can also take part in our Locked On Mets sign photo giveaways. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find a link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Now, if the Mets sign Soto and Pete Alonso is going to sign elsewhere, which teams are going to be interested? Well, let's first talk about the teams that miss on Juan Soto in this scenario. First and foremost, the New York Yankees. Would the Yankees want to maybe sign Pete Alonso out of spite? It could make a lot of sense. They need a first baseman. And Pete Alonso and Aaron Judge in the same lineup is a lot of power. So I could see that happening. Now, who else? The Boston Red Sox. If they strike out on Juan Soto, could they sign Pete Alonso? They have a first baseman in Tristan Casas, but maybe they want to get creative. Maybe they want to sign Pete Alonso, have one of them DH, or maybe they decide to flip Tristan Casas on the trade market. They've been interested in Garrett Crochet. They have a lot of top prospects. Maybe you want to save some of those top prospects, and you can put Tristan Casas as one of the centerpieces of the deal. The White Sox, who are probably a little bit scared to make a bad trade on Crochet, they get a near-proven commodity, a guy that should hit in Casas that they can just start at first base and hold on to him, and maybe he becomes a trade asset down the line. Maybe he becomes a fixture. But for the Red Sox, you can use Casas to get an ace in Crochet, and you got Pete Alonso as your first baseman. It's a possibility. Who else? The Blue Jays. If they strike out on Soto, are they in on Pete Alonso? I doubt it. They got Vladdy. Why would they need him? The Dodgers, they got Freddie Freeman. They don't need Pete Alonso. So then you look at other teams. Are the Giants going to get in on Pete Alonso? They're always in on some top free agents. They could use power in their lineup. They traded Jorge Soler at the deadline last year, got out of that contract. Maybe they want another DH. They do have Lamont Wade, but, they could make both of those guys work in their lineup. Is that a landing spot? It could be. Who else? The Mariners? The Cubs? Well, the Cubs, they got Michael Busch. They got Cody Bellinger. They have a couple of options at first base already. Are they really going to be in on Pete? Do they need a DH? They got Seiya Suzuki. So I don't really see the Cubs being in on it. The other two teams that jump out to me are the Astros and the Nationals. Now, the Astros, they need a first baseman. They also need a third baseman if they don't re-sign Bregman. I think if they're going to spend the money it would take to get Pete, they would just re-sign Bregman. And that's where I think the Astros might not make the most sense, but maybe Bregman gets more years. And maybe Alonso's market isn't as healthy and it ends up being a little more affordable where you only have to commit 5 years to Pete. And Bregman has already taken a better offer to sign somewhere else. I could see it as a fit. And Pete would kill there. Pete Alonso might hit 50 home runs again if he got those Crawford boxes. I mean, that's a good ballpark for him to hit in. That'd be a great lineup for him to hit in. If he got to hit before or after Yordan Alvarez, I mean, it's pretty good. Had Kyle Tucker as protection. Who knows how they'd line it up. That'd be a really good spot for Pete. And I'd be pretty happy for him, honestly, because why do I care if he's an Astro? I feel like that'd be a good winning situation for him. The Nationals are one that I just can't get out of my head. Ever since I came up with that as a landing spot a couple months ago, it's the one that sticks out where they don't seem like the obvious contender for a Pete Alonso, but they have a couple guys that we saw debut last year in James Wood, Dylan Cruz. They have CJ Abrams, although they don't seem to like him too much. But they got a budding core. And they have a lot of money coming off their books. Patrick Corbin, gone. So you can replace the $35 million that you spent on Corbin this past year, sign Pete, and still have $10 million to spare. And you can take a guy who has crushed you across his career, who's been in this division, and he could become the beginning of trying to get relevant again. So I actually think the Nationals are a very sneaky fit for Pete Alonso. And maybe that's a situation where the free agency has stalled a little bit, it's taken some time, and all of a sudden the most aggressive team ends up being the Nationals because they see an opportunity, and all of a sudden Pete's signing a 7+ year deal to go over there. I don't know. It's very interesting to try to explore Pete Alonso's free agent market because first base is one of the few deep positions this year. You have Christian Walker, who is probably going to have his contract inflated a bit because of Pete Alonso's presence in the market, and teams that maybe don't want to spend on Pete get in a bidding war for the second best guy on the market. You have Paul Goldschmidt, who had a bad year but came on a little bit in the second half that teams might like as a stopgap. You have Carlos Santana, another potential stopgap. So there's options. Josh Bell, I think, is back on the market again. First base is a position that teams can fill relatively easily on the market, whether it's through trade, through free agency, or even a prospect. They can always stick a prospect that can hit over at first base and see what happens. So the market can dry up on Pete Alonso in a pretty significant way. And the fact that there's not a ton of teams showing interest right now, I don't know if that's because Pete Alonso is solely focused on the New York Mets and that situation can't resolve itself until Soto is decided, or if maybe there's not a lot of interest in Pete Alonso because he's a first baseman who's not necessarily a great one defensively, who over the last 2 years you can say is on a bit of a decline. Here's what I would say about Pete Alonso. You could not have put together a 6-year tenure much better than what Pete Alonso has done for the New York Mets. He's done everything right. Everything. From how he's handled the media, the work that he puts in, and the durability. How many games has Pete Alonso missed in his career? I'm going to count them off right now because I didn't put this in my notes, but I think it's pretty interesting. So get your guesses ready. 16, 18, 26. 26 games in 6 years that Pete Alonso has missed. This guy's got drilled in the hand many a time, and he's only had one IL stint in his entire career. It's pretty remarkable how this guy has just fought through time and again and been able to stay on the field. It's amazing. I think he's durable. I think he's going to hit home runs no matter what. He's going to be at least over 30 home runs every single year for the next 5 years at least. He's going to drive in runs. And he's a fan favorite. So many Mets fans have a Pete Alonso jersey, have an LFGM shirt, a polar bear something. I've talked about my nephew. He's just getting into baseball, and when he swings the bat really hard and hits the ball far, he calls it a Pete Alonso. There's a lot of young Mets fans who have grown up with him being their favorite player. That has a lot of value. And regardless of what happens with Juan Soto, I just would hate to see Pete Alonso wear another uniform. Pete Alonso should have number 20 hanging in the rafters one day. He really should. But we won't know until that contract is signed over this next month here what his future holds. So for now, we wait and see. As much as everyone's excited to see what happens with Juan Soto, I'm probably more curious in some ways about Pete Alonso. Because as a fan, it's hard to remove the heart from these things. And I remember how much it sucked just a couple years ago to see Jacob deGrom sign with the Rangers. And you could say that was the right decision because, sure, he got Tommy John surgery. Would I want Jacob deGrom on the Mets next season? I would. That's just me. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. Thank you all for tuning in. We will see what happens with Juan Soto, and we'll be covering that throughout this week because the decision appears to be imminent. If there's any interesting information that's relevant, I will definitely be talking about on the show. Otherwise, we might be discussing some bullpen options on Friday's show. That's what seems like the audience wants me to talk about based on the feedback I got yesterday. So I'll try to dive in and give you guys some names, and we will go through that. As always, make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on X at Finkelstein. Ryan, follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen or your first watch every day. And for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. Talking about Locked On Sports today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.